department suffered, and his chief took him severely to task, pointing out that he was paid to do certain work and was failing to do it as it should be done. I am told, he said, you're acting as a voluntary helper for the sanitary groups. You do this on your own time, so it doesn't matter to me. But the best way of making yourself useful in a time like this is to do your own work very well. Otherwise, everything else is useless. He's right, said Grand to Ryu later. Yes, he's right, the doctor agreed. But I can't steady my thoughts. It's the end of my phrase that's worrying me. I can't sort it out. The number of sibilants in this sentence still offended his ear, but he saw no way of fixing it without using what were to his mind inferior synonyms. And flower-strewn, which had rejoiced him when he first found it, now seemed totally unsatisfactory. How could one say the flowers were strewn, when presumably they had been planted along the avenues, or else grew there naturally? On some evenings, indeed, he looked more tired than Dr. Ryu. Yes, this unavailing quest, which never left his mind, had worn him out. Nevertheless, he went on adding up the figures and compiling the statistics needed for the sanitary groups. Very patiently, every evening, he brought his totals up to date, illustrated them with graphs and charts, and racked his brains to present his data in the most exact and clearest form. Quite often he went to see Dr. Ryu at a hospital and asked if he could have a table in the office or dispensary. He would settle down with his papers exactly as he settled down at his desk in the municipal office, and wave every completed sheet to dry the ink in the warm air, noise them with disinfectants and the disease itself. At this time, he made honest efforts not to think about the horsewoman, and concentrated instead on the sanitary squad and how to help them. If it is a fact that people like to have examples given, men of the type they call heroic, and if it is absolutely necessary that this narrative includes at least one hero, the narrator commends to his readers, with perfect justice, this insignificant and obscure hero, who had to his credit only a little goodness of heart and an absurd idea. This will render to the truth its due, to the addition of 2 and 2 the sum of 4, and to heroism the secondary place that rightly falls to it, just after, and never before, the noble claim of happiness. It will also give this chronicle its character, which is intended to be that of a narrative made of good feelings amid bad times. That is to say, feelings that are not bad or overcharged with emotion in the ugly manner of a stage play. Such, at least, was Dr. Ryu's opinion when he read in newspapers or heard on the radio messages and encouragement that the outer world was transmitting to the plague-ridden town. Besides the comforts sent by air and over land, compassionate and admiring comments were lavished on the isolated town, newspaper articles and broadcast talks. And invariably, their epic or prize speech verbiage jarred on the doctor. Needless to say, he knew the sympathy was genuine, but it could be expressed only in conventional language with which men try to express what unites them in general. A vocabulary quite unsuited, for example, to Grand's heroic daily effort, adding totals, and incapable of describing what Grand stood for under plague conditions, a mere clerk in the middle of a hospital, exposed. Sometimes at midnight, in the silence of the sleep-bound town, the doctor would turn on his radio before going to bed. He would allow himself a few hours' sleep. From the ends of the earth, across thousands of miles of land and sea, kindly, well-meaning people tried to voice their feelings, and indeed they did so, but at the same time proved the utter incapacity of men truly to share suffering they cannot see or feel. Oran, they said, in vain, the call ringing over the oceans. In vain the doctor listened hopefully. Always the tide of eloquence began to flow, bringing home still more the gulf that lay between Grand and the speaker. Oran, we're with you. We're all in this together, they called emotionally. But not, the doctor thought, to love or die together. And that's the only way to do it, he thought. They're just too remote. And As it so happens, what has yet to be recorded before coming to the culmination during the period when the plague was gathering its forces to fling them at the town and lay it waste. The long, heart-rending, monotonous struggle put up by some obstinate people, like Rambert, to recover their lost happiness and balk the plague of the part of themselves which they were ready to defend to the last. Their way of resisting the bondage closing in upon them, and while their resistance lacked any virtue, it had its point, and moreover it bore witness, even if in its futility and incoherence, to a salutary pride. Rambert fought to prevent the plague from besting him. Once assured that there was no way of getting out of the town legally, he decided, as he told Dr. Rieu, to have recourse to other means. He began by finding cafe waiters. A waiter knows everything that's going on behind the scenes. The first few he spoke to knew only of the very heavy penalties visited upon attempts at evasion or escape. In one cafe he visited, he was actually taken for a stool pigeon and curtly sent about his business. It was not until he happened to meet Cottard at Rieu's place that he made a little headway. On that day, he and Rieu had been talking again about unsuccessful efforts to interest the authorities in this case, and Cottard heard the tail end of this conversation. Some days later, Cottard, or this is the guy that tried to kill himself, Cottard met him in the street and greeted him with the hail fellow well-met manner that he now used to everyone on every occasion. "Hello, Rambert, still no luck?" "None whatever," he said. "It's no good counting on the red tape merchants. They couldn't understand if they tried." "I know that," he said, "and I'm trying to find some other way, but it's damn difficult." "Yes," Cottard replied, "I'm sure it is." However, he said, he knew a way to go about it, and he explained to Rambert, who was much surprised, that for some time past he had been going the rounds of the cafes, made a number of acquaintances, and had learned of the existence of an organization which would handle this sort of business. The truth was that Cottard, who had been beginning to live above his means, was now involved in smuggling ventures concerned with rationed goods. Selling contraband cigarettes and inferior or poisoned liquor at steadily rising prices, he was well on his way to building up a small fortune. "Are you sure of this?" Rambert asked. "Oh, quite. I had a proposal of the sort made to me the other day." "But you didn't take it?" "Come on now, there's no need to be suspicious," Cottard said. "I didn't accept it because personally, I don't want to leave. I have my reasons." He added, "You didn't ask me what my reasons are." "I take it," Rambert replied, "that they're none of my business." "That's so, of course, but from another angle. I've been feeling much more at ease here since the plague settled in, and the gates have been closed." Rambert made no comment, and then he asked, "How do I approach this organization, as you call it?" "Aha," Cottard replied, "it's not easy. Come with me." It was 4 p.m. The town was beginning to warm up to its boiling point under the sultry sky. No one was around, and every shop was closed. Cottard and Rambert walked some distance without speaking under the arcades. This was an hour of the day when the plague lay low, so to speak. The silence, the extinction of all color and movement, might have been due as much to the fierce sunlight as to the epidemic, and there was no telling if the air was heavy with menace or merely with the dust and heat. You had to look closely and take thought to realize the plague was here, all around you. It betrayed its presence only by negative signs. So, Cottard, who had an affinity for it, drew Rambert's attention to the absence of dogs that in normal times would have been seen sprawling in the shadow of the doorways, panting, or trying to find a patch of coolness. They went along the boulevard, crossed the Place d'Armes, and then turned down towards the docks. On the left was a cafe painted green with a wide awning of coarse yellow canvas projecting over the sidewalk. Cottard and Rambert wiped their brows when they entered. There were a few small iron tables, also painted green, and some folding chairs. The room was empty, the air humming with flies, and in a yellow cage on the bar, a parrot squatted on its perch, every feather drooping. Some old pictures of military scenes covered with grime and cobwebs adorned the walls, and on the tables, including the one at which Rambert sat, bird droppings were drying, and he was puzzled where they came, until after some wing flapping, a handsome cock came hopping out of his retreat in a dark corner. Just then, the heat seemed to rise more. Cottard took off his coat and banged on the tabletop. A very small man wearing a long blue apron that came nearly to his neck came from the doorway at the back, shouted a greeting to Cottard, and vigorously kicking the rooster out of his way, came up to the table. Raising his voice to drown out the indignant cackling, he asked what the gentleman would like. Cottard ordered white wine and said, "Where's Garcia?" The small man replied he had not shown up at the cafe for several days. "Do you think he'll come tonight?" "Well, I don't know his secrets, but you know when he usually comes." "Yes," said Cottard. "Really, it's not urgent, but I need him to know this friend of mine." The barkeeper rubbed his moist hands on the front of his apron. "Oh, so this gentleman's in the business, too." "Yes," said Cottard. The little man snuffled. "All right, come back this evening, and I'll send the kid to warn him." After they had left, Rambert asked what the business in question was. "Well, smuggling, of course. They get the stuff in past the sentries at the gate. There's plenty of money in it." "I see." Rambert paused and then said, "I take it they have friends in court?" "You said it. Absolutely." In the evening, the awning was rolled up, the parrots squawking, and the small tables were surrounded by men in their shirt sleeves. When Cottard returned, one man with a white shirt gaping on a brick-red chest and a straw hat planted well back on his head stood up. He had a sun-tanned face, regular features, black eyes, very white teeth, and a few rings on his fingers. He looked to be about 30. "Hi," he said to Cottard, completely ignoring Rambert. "Let's have one at the bar." They drank 3 rounds in silence. "How about a stroll?" Garcia asked. They walked toward the harbor. Garcia asked what he was wanted to do. Cottard explained it wasn't for him or for a deal, but that he wanted to introduce his friend, Rambert, but only for what he called a getaway. Puffing at his cigarette, Garcia walked straight ahead. He asked very few questions, always referring to Rambert as he, and appearing not to even notice that he was present. "Why does he want to leave?" "Well, his wife is in France." "Aha!" After a short pause, he said, "What's his job?" "Oh, he's a journalist." "Is he now? Journalists have loose tongues." "I told you he's my friend," said Cottard. They walked on in silence, until they were near the wharf, which was now railed off. They turned in the direction of a small tavern from which came a smell of fried sardines. "In any case," Garcia said finally, "it's not up my alley. Raoul's your man, and I'll have to get in touch with him. It's not easy right now." "Is that so?" said Cottard. "Is he lying low?" Garcia made no answer. At the door of the tavern he stopped, and for the first time he spoke to Rambert directly. "The day after tomorrow at 11. At the corner of the customs barracks in the upper town." He turned as if to leave, then had an afterthought. "It's going to cost a lot, you know." He made the observation casually. Rambert nodded. "Naturally." On the way back, the journalist thanked Cottard. "Don't mention it, old man. I'm only too glad to help you. And you're a journalist. I think you'll put in a good word for me one day or another." 2 days later, Rambert and Cottard climbed the wide street leading to the upper part of the town. The barracks, occupied by the customs officers, was partly transformed into a hospital, and a number of people were allowed to visit a patient, a very futile hope, since such visits were strictly prohibited. A number of people were standing outside the main entrance, waiting. Others stood there hoping for news about some invalid, news that in the course of an hour wouldn't even matter. For these reasons, there were always a number of people and a certain amount of movement at this spot, a fact that probably accounted for its choice by Garcia for his meeting with Rambert. "I'm puzzled," Cottard remarked. "Why you want to leave? I mean, what's happened here is extremely interesting, and you're a journalist." "It's not interesting to me," Rambert replied. "Well, yes, I mean, we run risks, I grant you, but all the same, when you come to think of it, we used to run as much risk in the old days just crossing a busy street." Just then, Ryu's car drew up level with them. Taru was at the wheel, and Dr. Ryu seemed half asleep. He woke himself to make some introductions. Oh, we know each other, Taru said. We're at the same hotel. He then offered to drive Rambert back to the center. Oh, no thanks, he said. I have an appointment here. Dr. Ryu looked hard at him. Yes, Rambert said. What's that? Cottard sounded surprised. The doctor knows about this? That's the magistrate. Taru gave Cottard a warning glance. And Cottard's look changed. Othon was striding down the street toward them, briskly, yet with dignity. He took off his hat as he came even with them. Good morning, Monsieur Othon, said Taru. The magistrate returned the greeting, and turning to Rambert and Cottard, who were in the background, gave them a quiet nod. Taru introduced Cottard and the journalist. The magistrate gazed at the sky for a moment, sighed, and said, These are indeed sad times. I've been told, Taru, he continued, that you are helping to enforce the prophylactic measures. I need hardly say how commendable that is. A very fine example. Do you think, Dr. Ryu, that the epidemic will get worse? Dr. Ryu could reply only that he hoped it wouldn't. The magistrate replied, One must never lose hope. The ways of Providence are inscrutable. Taru asked if his work had increased as a result of the present conditions. To the contrary, said the magistrate, criminal cases of what we call the first instance are very rare now. In fact, my only work just now is holding inquiries into the breaches of the new regulations. Our ordinary laws have never been so well respected. That's because, by contrast, they appear to be good ones, said Taru. The magistrate, who seemed unable to take his gaze off the sky, abruptly dropped his meditative air and stared at Taru. Why does it matter? It's not the law that counts, it's the sentence. And that is something we must all accept. That fellow, said Taru, when the magistrate was out of hearing, is enemy number one. He pressed the car starter. A few minutes later, Rambert and Cottard saw Garcia approaching. Without making any sign of recognition, he came straight up to them and by way of greeting said, You have to wait a bit. There was complete silence in the crowd all around them, most of whom now were women. Nearly all were carrying parcels. They had the vain hope of somehow smuggling these into their sick relatives, and the even crazier idea that the latter could even eat this food that they brought. The gate was guarded by armed sentries, and now and then an eerie cry resounded in the courtyard. Whenever this happened, anxious eyes turned towards the sick ward. The three men were watching the scene when a brisk good morning from behind them made them swing around. In spite of the heat, Raoul was wearing a well-cut dark suit and a felt hat with a rolled-up brim. He was tall and strongly built, and his face was pale. Hardly moving his lips, he said quickly and clearly, Let's walk down to the center. You, Garcia, stay here, we don't need you. Garcia lit a cigarette and sat down while they walked away. Raoul, placing himself between Rambert and Cottard, set the pace, a very fast one. Garcia explained to me what's happening, he said. We could fix it, but it'll cost cool 10,000. Rambert said he would agree to these terms. Lunch tomorrow, the Spanish restaurant near the docks. Rambert said, right, sure, and Raoul quickly shook his hand, smiling for the first time. After he had left, Cottard said he wouldn't be able to come to the lunch the next day. He had another engagement, but Rambert didn't need him anymore. The next day, Rambert entered the Spanish restaurant, and everyone turned to stare at him. The dark, cellar-like room, below the level of the street, was patronized only by men, mostly Spaniards, judging by their looks. Raoul was sitting at a table in the back of the room. As soon as he beckoned to the journalist and Rambert started to go toward him, the curiosity left the faces of others, and they bent over their plates and looked away again. Raoul had beside him a tall, thin, unshaven man, with enormously wide shoulders, an equine face, and thin hair. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, displaying long, skinny arms covered with thick black hair. When Rambert was introduced, he nodded slowly. His own name was not announced, and Raoul, referring to him, simply said, Our friend. Our friend here thinks he may be able to help you. He is going to put you in touch with two of our friends, who will introduce you to some sentries who we've squared it away with. That doesn't mean you can start now. You have to leave it to the sentries to tell you when the best moment is. The easiest thing will be for you to stay some nights with one of them. His home is very near the gate. The first thing is for our friend here to give you the contacts needed, and then when that is set, you can settle with him for expenses. The friend slowly moved his head up and down, without ceasing to munch the tomato and pimento salad he was shoveling into his mouth, after which he began to speak with a slight Spanish accent. He asked Rambert to meet him the next day but one, at 8 in the morning, in the cathedral porch. "Another 2 days' wait," Rambert said. "It ain't so easy as all that, you see," said Raoul. "Them boys take some finding." The friend nodded slow approval one more time. Some time was spent looking for another subject of conversation. The problem was solved easily when Rambert discovered that the horse-faced man was an ardent football player. He, too, was very keen on soccer. They discussed the French championship, the English teams, the technique of passing, and by the end of the meal, they were in high good humor, calling each other old boy and convincing each other about the sporting position of the center half. The discussion proceeded peacefully until a radio was turned on, and then broke into an announcement that there had been 137 plague deaths on the previous day. No one present betrayed the least emotion. The friend merely shrugged and stood up. Raoul and Rambert followed his example. As they were leaving, he shook Rambert's hand vigorously. "My name is Gonzalez," he said. To Rambert, the next 2 days seemed endless. He looked up Dr. Ryu and described to him the latest developments, and then accompanied the doctor on one of his calls. He left him on the doorstep of a house where a patient, suspected to have plague, was awaiting. There was a sound of footsteps and voices in the hall. The family were being warned that the doctor had arrived. "I hope Teru will get here," Ryu murmured. He looked very worn out. "Is the epidemic getting worse?" Rambert asked. Dr. Ryu said it wasn't that. Indeed, the death graph was holding steady. Only they lacked adequate means of treating the disease. "We're short of all equipment. In all the armies of the world, a shortage of equipment is compensated for by manpower. But we don't have manpower either." "Aren't there doctors and trained assistants sent from other towns?" "Well, yes," said Ryu, 10 doctors, about 100 helpers. "It sounds like a lot, but it's barely enough to cope with the present state of affairs, and it will be quite inadequate if anything gets any worse." Rambert, who had been listening to the sounds inside the house, turned to Ryu. "Well, you'd better make haste to win your battle," and then a shadow crossed his face. "You know," he said in a low tone, "it's not because of the plague that I'm leaving." Ryu replied that he knew very well, but Rambert went on to say, "I don't think I'm a coward, not as a rule, and I've had opportunities of testing it. Only there are some things I simply cannot endure." The doctor looked him in the eye. "You'll see her again," he said. "Maybe, but I can't stomach the thought that it may last on, and all the time she'll be growing older. At 30, one's beginning to age. I'm already trying to squeeze all I can out of life. But I doubt if you could understand." Dr. Ryu was about to reply that he thought he could, when Teru came up, very excited. "I've asked Father Panaloo to join us," he said. "Well," said the doctor. He thought about it and then said yes. "That's good," the doctor said. "I'm glad to know he's better than his sermon." "Most people are like that," said Teru. "It's only a matter of giving them the chance." He smiled and winked at Ryu. "My job in life is to give people chances." "Excuse me," Rambert said. "I've got to leave." On Thursday, the day of the appointment, Rambert entered the cathedral porch at 5 minutes to 8. The air was cool. Small fleecy clouds were drifting across the sky, and a faint smell of moisture rose from the lawns, parched even though they were. Still masked by the eastward houses, the sun was warming up Joan of Arc's helmet only, and it made a solitary patch of brightness in the cathedral square. The clock struck 8, and Rambert took some steps in the empty porch. From inside came the low sound of intoning voices, which shortly ceased. 10 small black forms came out of the building and ran away towards the center of the town. Rambert was impatient. Other black forms entered the porch. He was about to light a cigarette when it struck him that smoking might be frowned on. At 8:15, the organ began to play very softly, and Rambert entered. At first, he could see nothing in the light of the aisle, but after a moment he made out in the nave the small black forms that had preceded him. They were all grouped in a corner, in front of an altar, on which stood a statue of Saint Roch, carved in haste by one of the local sculptors. Kneeling, they looked even smaller than before, a clotted darkness hardly more opaque than the smoky haze in which they seemed to float. The organ was playing endless variations above them. When Rambert stepped out of the cathedral, he saw that Gonzalez was already going down the steps on his way to leave for the town. "I thought you shoved off, old boy," he said to the journalist, "considering how late it is." He proceeded to explain that he had gone to meet his friends at the place agreed upon at 10 to 8 and waited 20 minutes without seeing them. Something must have held those boys up. There's a lot of snags, in our line of business. He suggested another meeting at the same time on the following day, but at the War Memorial. Rambert sighed and pushed his hat back on his head. "Don't take it so hard," said Gonzalez. "Think of all the swerves and runs and passes you got to make to score a goal." "Well, that's true," Rambert agreed, "but a game lasts only an hour and a half." The War Memorial at Oran stands at the one place where you can have a glimpse of the ocean, a sort of esplanade following for a short distance the brow of a cliff overlooking the harbor. The next day, being again the first to arrive at the meeting, Rambert whiled away the time reading the list of names of those who had died for their country. Some minutes later, two men strolled up, looked at him casually, and then rested their elbows on the parapet, gazing down intently at the empty, lifeless harbor. Both wore short-sleeved jerseys and blue trousers, and were of much the same height. The journalist moved away, and seated on a stone bench, studied them at leisure. They were obviously young, not more than 20. Just then he saw Gonzalez coming up. "Those are our friends," he said, after apologizing for being late. He led Rambert to the two youths, who he introduced as Marcel and Louis. They looked so much alike that Rambert had no doubt they were brothers. "Right," said Gonzalez. "Now that you know each other, you can get down to business." Marcel, or Louis, said that their turn of guard duty began in 2 days and lasted a full week. They would have to watch for a night when there was the best chance of bringing off an escape. The trouble was that there were two other sentries, regular soldiers besides themselves, at the west gate. These two men had to be kept out of the business. You couldn't depend on them, and it would pile up expenses anyway. Some evenings, however, these two sentries spent several hours in the back room of a nearby bar. Marcel, or Louis, said the best thing Rambert could do would be to stay at their place, which was only a few minutes' walk from the gate, and wait until one of them came to tell him the coast was clear. It would be quite easy for him to then make his getaway. But there was no time to lose. There was talk about setting up duplicate sentry posts a little further out. Rambert agreed, and he handed some of his few remaining cigarettes to the young men. The one who had not yet spoken asked Gonzalez if the question of expenses was settled, and whether an advance would be given. "No," Gonzalez said. "You don't need to worry about it. He's a friend of mine. He's going to pay right before he leaves." Another meeting was arranged. Gonzalez suggested their dining together on the next day but one, at the Spanish restaurant. "For the first night," he added, "I'll keep you company." The next day, on his way to his bedroom, Rambert met Theroux coming down the stairs at the hotel. "Want to come with me?" he said. "I'm going to go see Dr. Rieu." Rambert hesitated. "I never feel sure I'm not disturbing him." "I don't think you need to worry about that," Theroux said. "He's talked about you quite a lot." The journalist thought hard. "Look here," he said. "If you have time to spare tonight after dinner, it doesn't matter how late, come to the hotel, the two of you, and have a drink with me." "That will depend on Dr. Rieu," Theroux said, "and on the plague." But at 11 o'clock that night, Rieu and Theroux entered the small, narrow bar of the hotel. There were 30 people crowded into it, talking at the top of their voices. Coming from the silence of the plague-bound town, the two newcomers were startled by this sudden burst of noise and stopped in the doorway. They understood the reason for it when they saw that liquor was still to be had here. Rambert, who was perched on a stool in the corner of the bar, beckoned to them. With complete coolness, he elbowed away a noisy customer beside him to make room for the two of them. No objection to a spot of something strong, he said. No, Teru replied, quite the contrary. Dr. Ryu sniffed the pungency of bitter herbs in the drink that Rambert handed him. It was hard to make himself heard in the din of voices, but Rambert seemed chiefly concerned with drinking. The doctor couldn't make up his mind whether he was drunk yet. At one of the two tables that occupied the remaining space, a naval officer with a girl on each side of him was describing to a fat, red-faced man a typhus epidemic he had lived through in Cairo. "We had camps, you know," he said, "for the natives, with tents for the sick ones and a ring of sentries. If a member of the family came along and tried to smuggle in one of those damn fool native remedies, they fired on sight. A bit tough, I grant you, but it was the only thing to do." At the other table, around which sat a bevy of bright young people, the talk was incomprehensible, half drowned out by the stridence of St. James Infirmary jazz coming from a loudspeaker just above their heads. "Any luck?" Dr. Ryu had to raise his voice. "I'm getting there," Rambert replied. "In about a week, I think." "It's a pity," Teru said. "Why?" Dr. Ryu said, "Teru said that because he thinks you might be useful to us here. Personally, though, I understand your wish to get away only too well." Rambert got off his stool and looked him in the eyes for the first time. "How could I be useful?" "Well, of course," Teru replied. "In one of the sanitary squads." The look of brooding obstinacy that Rambert so often had came back to his face, and he climbed again to his stool. "Don't you think these squads of ours do any good?" said Teru, who had just taken a sip of his glass. "I'm sure they do," the journalist replied. Ryu noticed that his hands were shaking, and he decided, definitely, that Rambert was very drunk. The next day, when for the second time Rambert entered the Spanish restaurant, he had to make his way through a group of men who had taken chairs on the sidewalk and were sitting in the cold evening light. They were smoking an acrid-smelling tobacco, and the restaurant itself was almost empty. Rambert went back to the table at which Gonzalez had sat when they met the first time. He told the waitress he would wait a bit. It was 7:30. The men from outside began to dribble in and seat themselves at the tables. The waitresses started serving them. Knives and forks and a hum of conversation began to fill the room. At 8 o'clock, Rambert was still waiting. The lights were turned on, and a new set of people took the other chairs. He ordered dinner, and at 8:30 he had finished without having seen either Gonzalez or the two young men. He smoked several cigarettes. The restaurant gradually emptied. Outside, night was falling rapidly, and the curtains hung across the doorway billowed in a warm breeze from the sea. At 9, Rambert realized that the restaurant was empty and the waitress was looking at him strangely. He paid and left, noticing that a cafe across the street was open, settled down there, at a place from which he could keep an eye on the entrance of the restaurant. At 9:30, he got up and walked slowly back to his hotel, racking his brains for some method of tracking down Gonzalez, whose address he didn't know, and bitterly discouraged by the not unlikely prospect of having to start the entire business all over again. It was at this moment, as he walked in the dark street, that it suddenly struck him that all this time he'd practically forgotten about the woman he loved, the woman in Paris. He had been so absorbed in trying to find a rift in the walls that cut him off from her, that at the same moment, now that once more all ways of escape were sealed up for him, he felt his longing for her blaze up again, with a violence so intense that he started to run to his hotel, as if to escape a pain that nonetheless pervaded him, racing like wildfire in his blood. Very early the next day, he called on Ryu to ask where he could find Cotard. "The only thing I can do is pick up the thread where I dropped it." "Come tomorrow night," Dr. Ryu said. "Teru asked me to invite Cotard here. I don't know why. He's coming at 10. You may as well come at 10:30. When Cotard visited the doctor the next day, Teru and Ryu were discussing the case of one of Ryu's patients who, against all expectations, had recovered. "It was 10-1 against him," Teru commented. "He was in luck." "Oh, come on now," Cotard said. "It can't have been plague." They assured him there was no doubt it was the plague. "That's impossible. He recovered. You know as well as I do, once you have the plague, your number's up." Ryu replied, As a general rule, that's halfway true. But if you refuse to be beaten, you can have pleasant surprises. Cottard laughed. Very few, anyhow. You saw the number of deaths this evening. Theroux, who was gazing amiably at him, said, yeah, he knew the latest figures, and the position was extremely serious. But what did it prove? Only that still more stringent measures should be applied. How? Said Cottard. You can't make it more stringent than it has now. No, but every person in town must apply them to himself to protect everyone else. Cottard stared at him in a puzzled manner, and Theroux went on to say that there were far too many people, and that the plague was everybody's business. Everyone should do his duty. For instance, every able-bodied man was welcome in the sanitary squads. That's an idea, said Cottard, but it won't get you anywhere. The plague has the whip hand of you, and there's nothing we can do about it. We would know whether that's so, Theroux's voice was controlled, only when we've tried everything, every one of us. Meanwhile, Dr. Rieux had been sitting and copying out reports. Theroux was still gazing at the little businessman who was stirring uneasily in his chair. Look here, Cottard, why don't you join us? Picking up his derby hat, Cottard rose from his chair with an offended expression. It's not my job, he said. Then, with an air of bravado, he added, what's more, the plague suits me quite well, and I see no reason why I should bother about trying to stop it. Theroux immediately struck himself in the forehead. Of course, I forgot. If it wasn't for this, you'd be arrested. Cottard was startled and gripped the back of his chair as if he were about to fall over. Dr. Rieux had stopped writing and was staring at him with grave interest. Who told you that? Cottard screamed. You told me, Theroux said. At least, that's what the doctor and everyone else in town has gathered from the way you speak. Losing control of himself, Cottard let out a volley of oaths. Don't get excited, Theroux said quietly. None of us here would dream of reporting you to any police. What you may have done is no business of ours. Anyway, I've never had any use for the police. So sit down again. Cottard looked at the chair and then lowered himself into it, heaving a deep sigh. It happened ages ago, he said. Somehow they've dug it up. I thought it had all been forgotten, but somebody started talking. They sent for me and told me not to budge until the inquiry was finished. And I felt pretty sure they would end up arresting me. Was it something serious? Theroux asked. That depends what you mean, he said. It wasn't murder, anyway. Prison? Transportation with hard labor? Cottard looked abject. Prison if I'm lucky. But then he grew excited. It was all a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes, and I can't bear the idea of being pulled in for that, torn from my home and everything I love. And is that the reason, Theroux said, why you had the bright idea of trying to hang yourself? Yes, Cottard said. It was a damn fool thing to do, I admit. And now, for the first time, the doctor spoke. He told Cottard that he understood his anxiety, but perhaps everything would come right in the end. For the moment, I've nothing to fear, Cottard said. I can see, said Theroux, that you're not going to join our effort. Twiddling his hat, Cottard gazed at him with shifty eyes. I hope you don't bear a grudge. Certainly not, but, Theroux smiled, do try at least not to infect people on purpose. Cottard protested that he would never want the plague. It was just chance that it had broken out, and he wasn't to blame if it made things easier and better for him. Then he plucked up his courage, and Rambert entered. He was shouting almost aggressively. What's more, I'm pretty sure you won't get anywhere with these squads. Rambert learned to his chagrin that Cottard didn't know where Gonzales lived. He suggested they better pay another visit to the cafe. They made an appointment for the following day. Dr. Rieux said he would like to be kept posted, and Rambert proposed that he and Theroux should look him up one night at the end of the week. They would come as late as they like, and be sure to find him in his room. The next morning, Cottard and Rambert went to the cafe and left a message for Garcia, asking him to come this evening, or if that could not be managed, the next day.
Yeah.
That night they waited for him in vain. But the next day he turned up. He listened in silence to what Rambert had to say, and then informed him he didn't know what happened, but knew that several districts of the town had been isolated for 24 hours for a house-to-house inspection. Possibly Gonzales and the two youngsters hadn't been able to get out of the cordon. All all he could do was put them in touch once more with Raoul. Naturally, this could not be done for 2 more days. I see, Rambert said. I have to start all over again from scratch. On the next day,